a brief introduction.
Sounds good.
So Tim Waring is one of my most respected colleagues. We were talking just a few minutes ago. And isn't it strange that that although academia, cultural evolution in academia should be highly reticulate, but in fact, it's highly bifurcating in terms of when you look at the lineages, academic lineages of people. And so Tim is part of the Richardson-Boyd lineage, which includes other famous people like Paul Smaldino, Sarah Matthews, Richard McElreath, Joe Henrich, all emanating from what's sometimes called the California School, sometimes distinguished from the Paris School, centered around Dan Sperber. But it really is like a bifurcating tree, much more than you might think, given all the cross communication that takes place in academia. So isn't that interesting? In any case, Tim did his undergraduate work at Haverford College in Pennsylvania, then went to UC Davis, and from there straight to the University of Maine, where he's been ever since. In their, I guess their economics department, Tim, or does it have another name? Environmental?
Yeah, it's called the School of Economics, but then I have half of my appointment is in the Mitchell Center for Sustainability Solutions.
Right, and so it's a highly ecologically oriented. And so Tim is very much in the multi-level cultural evolution school. Also is highly involved with the Cultural Evolution Society, where you had the main sustainability group. Is that right, Tim?
Yeah, yes, I sort of helped to start this sustainability working group of the society back in 2016, 17, and then been growing ever since. And it's 150 some members now, so it's exciting. I think it's actually getting to the point where we're starting to be a place where people come to connect those two things, which is exciting.
Yeah, and so we're very much intending and on our way basically towards forging a strong tie between pro-social world and the Cultural Evolution Society with your help, Tim. So all good, and this seminar is a step in that direction. So so please let's take it away.
Sure. But thank you all for coming. I'm going to take over your screens or some portion thereof. So here we are. Now I'm going to give a talk which is not on my key focus, which is sustainability and the evolution of sustainable institutions and behaviors in humans. Instead, I'm going to talk about the evolution of cooperative organizations and the role of human cooperation in them. Of course, a lot of these topics will be familiar to people who have been involved in David's work and pro-social. Just to give before I even go any further, I want to just acknowledge and thank a handful of my graduate students over the years. Importantly, Ethan Tremblay, Afton Hupper, Taylor Lang, Antonio Urlina, as well as Sujan Chakraborty, all of whom are involved in this in various ways and on papers and things. So here's what I'm going to be doing today. We're going to talk about, at first, I'm going to argue that cooperatives require some kind of special explanation. And then, of course, I'm going to argue that if we can understand the evolution of cooperation in the right way, this can help. And then I'm going to try to sort of wrap that into a theory that we can sort of go through and march through some evidence for. And I'll give you that evidence that comes out of a set of work that I've done, some of which is complete and some of which is not. So let's start off with this question of what are cooperatives? This is the food co-op in Davis, California, a wonderful place. So what are cooperatives? I want to place them in the context of all human organizations. They're just one type of organization. And by that, I mean a culturally organized human group with some shared goal, right? That's an organization. And of course, there are many different types, right? We have farms and restaurants and government agencies and armies and schools and markets and religions and they're extremely diverse. So where do cooperatives fit in this? Cooperatives are special in a couple of ways. And the three ways that I'd like to point out here first are there's a collective decision-making structure, typically in cooperatives, collective ownership, a very flat level at the level of decision-making and ownership, and then finally collective benefit. And so this makes cooperatives somewhat different than hierarchical organizations, which are actually probably quite a bit more common. Moreover, cooperatives have a special set of patterns. Economically, they're often considered less efficient, less profitable, slower to innovate than private firms. They also do this strange thing of emerging and even doing well in harsh economic conditions, which is peculiar in comparison to traditional firms. The economic literature also says that they generate social capital, community benefits, local economic development. They're actually used as an economic development tool in some parts of the world. Cooperatives have also been observed to underperform in fast-growing sectors in comparison to other firms. During a crisis, for example, co-ops will sometimes retain all of their employees and lower wages across the board rather than cutting employees. And they do this at the cost of profits. However, they can also grow to become less egalitarian as they get larger. And so that's a really interesting phenomenon. And finally, they're relatively infrequent, about 4 to 7% globally. So, and finally, there's some theory problems with economics that make these things unlikely in a standard sort of economic theory way. I'm going to skip that particular detail, be happy to dive into it. But in summary, in comparison to traditional hierarchical organizations, cooperatives are structured differently, and they face some strange growth challenges and patterns. And so I argue that they need some kind of special explanation. They are not the run-of-the-mill organization. So I will argue that the role of cooperation is, of course, important in cooperatives. That's no surprise to anyone who can read English. But I specifically want to propose that cooperation has a very important mechanistic role in both the survival and development and operation of cooperatives, and also in their long-term evolution. And so what I will do is present an evolutionary theory of cooperatives, or how cooperation helps explain cooperatives. And it's not just cooperation, however. And in order to present an evolutionary theory, it should be complete. And in my mind, that means it should go back, sort of relatively speaking, all the way. So the first point I'd like to make is that I believe, and I think there's good evidence to think, that cooperation and culture are the two signature adaptations of our species. And that is central to why I'm so interested in cooperatives. Because humans are, sure, we're smart, but we're not particularly well adapted to one special environment. Instead, what we're really good at doing is we're really good at teaming up and beating the environment together. Now, here we are doing some cooperative hunting. Cooperative hunting is actually common in the animal world. And so you might say, well, then we're not so special about cooperation. Moreover, cooperative breeding and rearing of young is also common in the animal world. However, in other animals, these cooperative behaviors are typically genetically encoded and relatively inflexible. Whereas in humans, we cooperate in a flexible way, coordinated culturally, linguistically, in real time, so that we can do things like take down this mastodon. So I'm going to argue that cooperatives are our best example of the ancestral organization, okay? That the way that humans spread and conquered the planet had to do with our ability to beat the environment at its own game, right? We can consume mastodons, we can remove apex predators and take their place. And we've done this in continent after continent that we've arrived at. Now, how do we do that? We do that by cooperation, which is organized culturally. And so if cooperatives themselves are the ancestral organization, then we can think of all of the rest of these types of organizations, private enterprise, government, religion, whatever, as being derivatives. And that's useful. And it's important if true. Of course, maybe this is not true. Maybe coercion happened first, culturally organized coercion. I don't know. But this is my little theory, and you'll have to deal with it as long as I'm giving the talk here. So, but that also gives us this interesting way of thinking of the long-term evolution of cooperative organizations, from ancestral cooperatives in deep time to modern cooperatives, right? Large, formal, legal businesses with billions of dollars of transactions, such as the Co-op group in the UK. But these reasons make it important for me to think of cooperatives not just as an ancestral organization or the ancestral organization, but as a model organization for study. One of the best and most important types of organizations to understand fully. And to highlight the reasons, because cooperation is central to human uniqueness, because all organizations require cooperation to some degree, and because cooperatives require cooperation especially, making that point really critical. They generate positive externalities, they emerge in harsh conditions, they're strange, they're maybe old. Let's study this. That's my pitch, and that's what I like to think about when I try to understand how cooperatives are working. One way to diagram this, though, is that they have this structure, this shared decision-making, ownership, and benefit structure, and that influences the behavior of members in cooperatives. Both of those factors influence how a given cooperative organization develops and changes over time, whether members stay, and what they're able to achieve with the cooperation they have. Similarly, those two factors influence the niche that they're in, the social and economic and perhaps even ecological niche in which we find cooperatives. As I've noted in the lit review there, sometimes they emerge in places where the going gets tough. And they survive sometimes better than other organizations, which is interesting. All of these factors then influence how they survive and adapt and respond to change in the long term. And so we're going to be looking at multiple pieces of this with a set of just very simple hypotheses. The first one is a hypothesis about their structure. In particular, that cooperatives depend on cooperation. No surprise. But the prediction here is that free riding constitutes a survival challenge for cooperatives. When you have members who are not pulling their weight, it gets harder for the whole thing to survive. The second one, which is about behavior, is that cooperatives, successful cooperatives, can breed prosociality and cooperation among their members. And the prediction is that therefore, we should expect that cooperatives exhibit more cooperation, more pro-social behavior than other organizations. The next one is about development. Now we can hypothesize that co-ops would adopt rules that reduce their reliance on cooperation, because cooperation can sometimes ebb and flow. And so therefore, we might expect that cooperatives, that we might see a decline in cooperation after a rule adoption that makes things more efficient, that makes it so that you don't need to rely on my generosity to get the work done because there's a schedule, for example. there's a hypothesis we can make about the niche, which is that to persist in harsh economic environments and to and generate high capital, cooperatives may be more tied to the local community than other types of organizations. This is already evident in the literature. And finally, adaptation, the biggest question of them all. I would hypothesize that the cooperative principles, which I will explain to you in a moment, or a set of institutions, are themselves a kind of adaptive trait that has emerged among cooperatives, and that they help maintain cooperation, perhaps, and help cooperatives survive. So we're going to go through each of these, and I'm going to give you little bits of evidence that I've gathered over time, which is part of an incomplete research program on cooperatives. And the first, and I'm going to give you evidence from food co-ops. I'm going to give you evidence from food buying clubs, which are small informal versions of food co-ops. And I'm going to give you some an historical study. First, I'm going to start with food buying clubs. These are small, self-organized, informal groups of acquaintances and friends who get together to buy bulk food and split those bulk items when they arrive from a central distributor, and they split them in their home and share them among everyone who's contributed. And so I have a couple of collaborators in this, the groups, the businesses that own the websites where people coordinate their purchases. And so, a distributor will arrive with a big truck, and then the results will be unpacked, and people will bring their boxes, and it will get sorted out. And people need to sort of say, I got so many pieces of these different pieces, and then you'll sort of share the items, often with your own containers, and you need to make sure to pay. And finally, there's often decision making involved. It can actually be a lot of organizational work to maintain a small food buying club. This is not even a co-op, it's just a club, but there's a lot of work it goes into sort of making it happen. Finally, you get to go home in the end with your food. And so the key of a food buying club is this fundamental underlying. So all of this organizational work requires cooperation and even effortful input from members. But in addition, there is a key cooperative act at the center of food buying clubs, and that is the challenge of splitting bulk items. And if you have a 25-pound bag of carrots, how do you split it among people? Well, maybe 3 people want to buy carrots, and maybe a 4th person is willing, but you actually need 5 to achieve 25 pounds of carrots that will be consumed. And so maybe Jenny doesn't really want to buy 3 pounds of carrots, but she's willing to contribute by saying, yes, I'll join, and I'll buy 3 pounds of carrots, and I'll figure out a way to cook with them this week, even though I don't really favor carrots that much. And hopefully it'll come out in the wash, and hopefully someone else will help me later. And this is an important problem, as I will show you. And so this economic cooperation is central to the function of a buying club. And it's key because people have different preferences, different food preferences. And so we did a bunch of surveys, interviews, we did some behavioral experiments. I've run some simulations. There's a little bit of growing social network analysis that has been done on these clubs. And we want to take a look here at this first one, where we're asking whether or not these cooperatives, these small food buying clubs, depend on cooperation, and whether free riding constitutes a survival challenge. And what I'm going to do is give you the example of the death of a food club. This is a food club that declined between 2012 and 2016. It lasted 6 years, and while it was happening, the leader of the food club worked around 4 to 6 hours a week making the thing work. As it grew in numbers and in purchase volume, the roles, at first there were 3 different roles, and then it grew to 15 different jobs. More cooperation was needed from people at the larger size because there was simply more to coordinate. they found that the open door policy that anyone could join became too costly because people would join and then purchase a few things and then leave. And so they stopped the open door policy. They had to make joining harder, they said. But making joining harder also caused the club to stop its growth spurt as well. Then on top of that, there was some serious personality friction, some people who were really not willing to do their jobs, to contribute in a regular way and just wanted to benefit from the ability to buy bulk items. They had some pretty differing versions of the rules, and people started to bend the rules in their favor. Then the leader, who was a woman, had a child, and for family reasons, she needed to step back from the leadership role. And within 1 year, that happened in 2015, within 1 year, the club collapsed. So you can see underlying that very human story, there's a story about the maintenance of cooperation within a group. It fell apart and cooperation was the reason. Now, this is something that we see happening throughout a large data set on these food clubs. We have this wonderful data set where we can look at all of the individual purchases that many food clubs make. And we find that by and large, people are very reciprocal in the purchases they make. I buy something with Barbara one day, and Barbara got what she wanted, but I didn't really get what I want. But the next day, Chris buys something with me, but he did that out of generosity. So later, Anna buys something with Chris, and it all comes around. As long as we are reciprocal generally, people can chip in to each other and help everyone buy the food they want. So the most common type of reciprocity is right away reciprocity. You buy something for me and I'll buy something for you within that same order. Although it also sort of happens spread out over time, we've found. I apologize for not having the population sample statistics. I took out a bunch of boring slides earlier, and I may have deleted the number of clubs that we have. And I'm happy to tell you about the data set and the way we did some of this collection and analysis later. And here we go, another version of this same type of information. This was collected by Taylor Lang. David, you'll be happy to know. We also had a survey, and in the survey, we asked people what their perceptions of how often they helped other people buy the bulk items they needed. And we also asked them how often they received the help buying the bulk items they want. Okay, so it's, I'm sorry, I said it the same way. How often they received help and how often they gave help. Okay. And you can look at these two and they kind of bounce around a bit, but you can see that on the helping graph, how often they feel like they help others, it starts somewhat low and it gets higher as you move towards the higher end of the percent of splits that people are helping with. Whereas where they receive help in green, it starts around 6 and it stays around 6. People feel, whether they do it or not is a different question, but people feel like they are helping each other more than they are getting help. And that is a key metric. Because if you feel that way, you'll probably be less likely to help out in the future. And that's the tension, that's the stress. So clubs struggle with cooperation. We decided to also do some behavioral experiments with these buying clubs. And we did 150 or so games within these clubs. These are 150 individuals who were playing these games across a handful of around 14 different clubs. And we played a dictator game as well as a public goods game. And both of them involve us, the experimenters, giving money to these individuals who could then, in the dictator game, keep all of it with no repercussions, or share some with an anonymous other club member. Okay. And in the public goods game, there is a group. The group is the entire club, and everyone gets to make their own anonymous choice about how much of their individual endowment they keep. They can keep all of it, or they can give all of it into this common fund. The common fund then grows. It's a cooperative effort, and it's an investment. It grows, but it is distributed, the outcome of the common fund is distributed evenly among all the participants, which means that the easiest, the best way, the only way, the way to make the most money, if that's all you care about, is to keep all of your money and let other people's investments come back to you as well. Okay, so this is two different measures, a measure of sort of individual level altruism, and also a measure of sort of what you might think of as group level cooperation. Okay, these were anonymous games. No one ever knew who they were, even though they knew they were members of their buying club. No one ever knew anyone's identities. It was all done online anonymously. It was a one-shot game, and we had $8 endowments for each game. The amazing thing about this is, even though that cooperation is a friction point for these groups, we found that among the dictator games that were equivalent that I found in the literature, this group beats community groups by 10%. We're far and away the highest amount of cooperation using this particular game, this structure of this game, an anonymous one-shot dictator game, in the literature. Interestingly, the same thing is true for the public goods game by a large margin. Now, there may be other research out there. I haven't updated these particular two slides in a while, but I would be surprised. The point is that there's especially high level of cooperation, even though cooperation requires and engages this tension. So that is the results here, and we'll come back and discuss this. That's the results for our first one, that free riding constitutes a survival challenge. We've seen that it constitutes a survival challenge, but now we can see, okay, cooperation may be somehow encouraged or bred within these cooperatives. But to dive even further into this, we did an experiment with a food co-op. This is a grocery store. And this is work by my master's student, Ethan Tremblay. And we just asked the question, are food cooperatives more cooperative, or shoppers at a food cooperative more cooperative than shoppers at a traditional grocery store? We used the dictator game. Here it is again. Ethan went to both of these two grocery stores in Blue Hill, Maine. And they are less than a mile apart from each other. They're both nice, and one is a traditional grocery store, hierarchically owned and managed and very efficient. You can walk in and get your stuff and leave. And the other one is the co-op. And the co-op is, and so what we did is conducted this experiment with people coming out of both of these organizations. And then we took a look at the results in terms of how cooperative people are. And amazingly, there's quite a notable difference. Here's what you have as the dollars donated on the left-hand side. Okay, so $10 is 100% of what they were given. So if someone was given $10, if they're on the high bar there, what that means is they turned around and gave all of it to the next anonymous stranger. Okay. And of course, you could keep all of it, all the way down at the bottom, 0. So that's the y-axis. On the x-axis, we have the difference between the frequency of this type of donation in the co-op versus in the grocery. So if the bar is on the blue side, people in the co-op gave more of that level of donation. If the bar is in the yellow side, people in the grocery gave more of that side type of donation. And so you can see, of course, a striking trend. There was a lot more giving of a lot less generous donations at the grocery store, and a lot more giving of a lot more generous donations at the co-op. So that's interesting. And this is true. I want to highlight, we did a Tobit regression, and we accounted for age and income and sex and education and some other variables. And the effect of the site still is the most strong. Keep in mind, these are in the same town. They're a mile apart from each other, and people often shop at both. So successful cooperatives should exhibit more cooperation than equivalent non-cooperatives. And so here we go. I want to highlight this for anyone who happens to be in a place where they can do it. We need to replicate this study desperately. This is a big finding, and it would be amazing if that could be replicated. And so
Sam, I can't help but break in. I typically don't break into talks like this, but I must ask a question. If you did an experiment where you caused the same people to go to one of the other grocery stores, might you also find a difference just from the priming effect of the environment?
Yeah, so, right, I don't know, to be honest, right? So this could be that the co-op makes people into cooperators. It could be that the co-op attracts cooperators. It could be that the co-op creates a short-term effect whereby when you're in the co-op, you act cooperatively, and when you're in the grocery store, you act accordingly there. The last one, I think, that you highlighted is perhaps most likely. People are really flexible. So that's that hypothesis. Thanks, David. For the next one, I want to take a look at the influence of rules. Rules that clubs or cooperatives institute over the course of their lifetime and their influence on cooperation. So in particular, I sort of have this hypothesis that if you adopt a rule, the rule helps to clarify things and can help to simplify the friction that's caused by the fact that cooperation takes energy, right? Can take work. And so that therefore maybe cooperation would decline after people adopt these rules. Well, let's take a look at that. Oh, you know what? I want to double check to make sure that I have. my list of, that's what's happening. My list of hypotheses is in the wrong place. Okay, we're going to keep going here. I don't have time to fix this. So we took a look at our buying clubs and distributed them in this shape. So this is the size of the buying clubs on the x-axis and how interconnected they are on the y-axis. There's a lot to learn from this data set, and I'm not going to give you all of the information about the social network analysis. However, we're even more interested in the impact of rules. And so this is a very simple plot with only those 14 clubs that agreed to be interviewed. You can see an interesting relationship here where what we see is these are each dot is a club. And on the x-axis, we have the age, and on the y-axis, we have simply the number of rules that the club has. And it is no higher than 6 and no lower than 1. But you'll notice there is no club above 20 years of age that has fewer than 4 rules. What does that mean? That means that there are 2 options. You start young, and you don't have very many rules for a while, but eventually either you add rules as a club or you stop existing, right? That's what that means. Now, granted, we only have 3 clubs that are over that are 30 years old, but it's no surprise to any of us being humans, and also no surprise knowing the data set, that these ones are by far the most institutionalized groups. They're large and they have a functional set of rules, and those rules matter and people stick to them. And so this is an interesting piece of information, particularly to the extent that it implies that clubs expire if they do not have rules. And maybe no clubs have expired and they've all just managed to survive, but I can tell you that there are far more younger clubs than there are older clubs. Okay. In addition, we can distinguish clubs based on their network structures. I'm going to skip this one because it requires more explanation than I think it will be beneficial. And so now, finally, I'm going to come to the last piece. This is the hypothesis that All of these things influence the adaptive evolution of clubs, the adaptive cultural evolution of, of cooperatives. In particular, I want to say that there are a set of principles and rules which have evolved over the course of many decades, in fact, over centuries, that help cooperatives survive. And we have published this piece as well. There's the link. And what we find, I'll just tell you right now, is that the cooperative principles constitute a group level cultural trait that we believe emerged through adaptive cultural evolution. And so if that were the case, then successful cooperatives should have rules that alleviate the free riding problem, and those rules should accumulate and spread. So I'm going to tell you the story of those rules. It goes back to 1844 England, in a place called Rochdale, where the Rochdale Society of Equitable Pioneers emerged during a downturn caused by the Industrial Revolution, where people who were weavers, they were in the textile trades, started to lose their jobs in large numbers because of weaving machines, because of textile machines. They were hardworking folk, though, and wanted to make things work, and came up with a way to basically agree to create another business. And in the business, they put down a bunch of rules. And this made the Rochdale Club the first modern codified cooperative. I want to say that with the caveat of in the English-speaking world. However, what's nice about these the rules that the Rochdale pioneers put down is that we can track them over history. In fact, we can track them directly over history. And they started in 1844 in Rochdale, and they went from there to the North of England Cooperative Wholesale Industrial and Provident Society in 1863, and then 1872. It was this exact same specific organization was renamed again into the Cooperative Wholesale Society, which in 2001 became named the Cooperative Group, and goes by this very stylistic thing, and owns this amazingly huge building in One Angel Square. So that is actually the same organization. So the Rochdale pioneers owned that building in essence, okay? The organization just sort of changed its name and structures over time. But let's take a look at the rules and what the rules were like. So here is the first set of laws. This is the objects of the Rochdale pioneers from the statutes of 1844. You can read them on your own. There's some really great work by Brett Fairbairn, 1994, on this that tracks these in detail. There's some really interesting ones in here that I think you will find a little bit peculiar. For example, the one about for the promotion of sobriety, a temperance hotel be opened in one of the society's houses as soon as is convenient. Apparently they had not enough sobriety, and so they needed a temperance hotel. And so that's an interesting rule, but it is one that they wrote down right along with a lot of other things, which you will see a bit more clearly in the second version here, which this is as refined later. Is this even 59? Yeah, I think this is 1959. Democratic control, rules governing the accumulation and distribution of the surplus, freedom of new members to join, voluntary membership, cash purchase and sale, that's an interesting one, political and religious neutrality, education of members, and determination to take over the world's economic and social system and reorganize it on cooperative lines. Fascinating. And so you get some interesting pieces in here like this, right? To a certain degree, this thing is a manifesto of sorts. Okay. Now, what Taylor and I did is we gathered as much data as we could, simply going back through the literature and historical information, and went back to 1844 and measured and just sort of categorized all of the rules that the categorized the rules broke these rules into categories of democracy, participation, education, nature of trading, quality, quantity, neutrality, interest, how interest is calculated, openness, networking, autonomy, and community. And you can see what happens is there are a handful of core principles that have been maintained and improved on and added to: democracy, participation, education. And then there have been some that just haven't made it, right? The Temperance Hotel didn't make it. The determination to take over the world didn't make it. However, other things have been added. And so this is a great example of what I like to think of as a cultural sort of genome, in a sense. And what's really interesting here is that it's not just that these things have been modified over time as they've been inherited down through the years and the decades, but also that there is some evidence, not great evidence, but there's evidence in the history that certain principles helped cooperatives survive. One of them was the democracy principle, where in the 20s and 30s, some of the co-ops became much less democratic. They became quite autocratic. Interestingly, the ones that were democratic survived better. Another one was this Dutch cooperatives with a one member, one vote rule appear to have done better, survived better than cooperatives with a share-based voting, based in terms of how much of the throughput is due to your activities. So that's an interesting one. There are also other examples that are less clear, but for example, one of them was a political neutrality principle, which became really important in the McCarthy era in the United States, when people were being accused of being communist, and cooperatives were somewhat suspect. And so having the political neutrality principle actually proved important. Another nice thing we see about this as an evolutionary pattern is that it looks for all the world like after 1844 and the Democratic and the Rochdale pioneers, these principles spread, and cooperatives spread and radiated with them and were modified. The only really clear data that we could get dates for have to do with the Mondragon Corporation in Spain, which definitely inherited its cooperative principles from the Rochdale pioneer lineage, although we don't know whether it happened all the way back in 1890 or it could have gone all the way up to much later, 1940. It happened, but it happened in that range somewhere. So this is an adaptive radiation of sorts. Of course, there's also the United States in terms of the English-speaking world and the cooperatives here that use these principles. Finally, there's one last piece here, which I think, which is extremely interesting and I think important, and that is their striking resemblance to another set of design principles that a lot of you will be familiar with. The institutional design principles of Elinor Ostrom, for which she won a Nobel Prize. Now, Elinor Ostrom analytically derived these principles by studying small-scale common pool resource management groups in the developing world. Someone has their, maybe we could mute other people. There we go. In Nepal and India and Mexico. And so what's amazing, though, is that they're very similar in nature, surprisingly similar. So similar that I tried to dig into Ostrom's readings and find evidence that she copied them from the co-ops. I couldn't find that evidence, actually. Maybe it's there, but I didn't find it. Now, of course, David and others have argued, and Lynn herself, that these principles that she highlights from her analysis are a general set of institutional adaptations, adaptive traits that help groups work, right? I think this is one of the most important findings in social science. But what's interesting is these were analytically derived, and they line up very well with the cooperative principles, which were not analytically derived. They evolved by cultural evolution over the period of 170 years. And so here are places where these rules should be expected to have factors that bolster cooperation. Okay, and we line them up one-to-one, and we can say there's a one-to-one match in the areas of membership and group decision-making and participation and group freedom and between group relations. And then there are a couple trends about that come from the co-ops only, and a couple that come from Eleanor Ostrom only. And those differences, I think, are really important. In particular, well, I'll come back to those. We can talk about this later. So there we have adaptation. The argument that these cooperative principles not only emerged to solve the cooperative problem and make cooperatives more tangible and functional, but did so well that they helped cooperatives flourish. And so that's this final piece. So now let's go through all of our bits here. We have some evidence that free riding constitutes a survival challenge. We have found some evidence that cooperatives exhibit more cooperation than other organizations. We have a little bit of evidence that rules may reduce reliance on cooperation, although that is shaky, I will admit. We did not measure anything about the niche, although you can read the literature on that. And finally, I think we have some strong evidence that the cooperative principles are able to at least improve survival, and it seems likely that they do so in part by supporting cooperation within these cooperatives. Okay, so what? Right? Co-ops, great, they use cooperation. That's not a surprise. Everyone knows this. Well, so they use cooperation. But cooperation determines the life cycle of cooperatives, and it influences everything about how they work. And not only this, but successful cooperatives have developed themselves or inherited institutions that help them manage cooperation better, overcome the free rider problem. And the cooperative principles are the most salient example of that. And lastly, I just want to highlight this because it doesn't come from my research, but it does come from the literature. Cooperatives tend to emerge in harsh economic environments. And the reason, I think, is because that's how humans solve problems when the going gets tough. So I want to propose again that cooperatives are a good model organization, a model organization for study, because they have these characteristics, and that cooperation is useful and indeed required in basically any organization. And so an evolutionary approach can help us find these things. We should be able to put cooperatives and their reliance on cooperation in some space where we can understand, well, what about, a hierarchical military unit? Well, that's different. It does have cooperation and or coercion involved in order to make it work. How does that work as a human organization? How do we understand that difference? And how do we understand they evolve? They both have rules. All organizations rely to some degree on human pro-social instincts. But I think that cooperatives are also likely an ancestral organization as well as the model organization for study. And I'm going to end it right there so we can chat. Thank you, everybody, very much for listening.
Oh, that's great. Let's stop the screen sharing so we can all see each other. Thank you so much. I got so much out of that. So wonderful.
Thank you.
So, my policy is I never ask the first question. I ask the fourth question. So now I have to draw upon other people to ask the first three questions.
Good for you. Good for you, David.
Questions? Who wants to go first?
Comments? Yeah.
There we go. Chris.
Go, Chris.
Oops,
You're muted.
Sorry, I'm wondering about trust, because some co-ops require people to pay on a trust basis. And I'm wondering how that factors into what you're talking about.
Can you tell me a little bit more about paying on a trust basis?
Well, so there are co-ops where people come in and they pick up their groceries and they pay based on what they picked up, and no one is monitoring that.
Okay, yeah, I can tell you that's one of the rules that has varied a lot. That connects to the history of the cash rules. There were these rules that emerged early on about requiring cash payment. And the reason for that was because part of the challenge was that people did not always have cash. And so they would open tabs. And that didn't work out because people weren't always able to pay off their debts. And so they implemented these cash rules, which I think worked in early England because people were quite poor. But that helped the group survive. I think it's, these things are very different nowadays for multiple reasons, one of which is society tends to be a little bit more wealthy overall, even for people on the poorer end of the economic spectrum. But I think it's related because of that difference, probably, right? It's easier for people to just say, oh, I'm just going to buy this stuff, and this is the stuff I'm picking up, and this is what I bought, and we don't need to do it that way. So there is a really interesting transition that I did not talk about here, where co-op food stores often started as food clubs. They start as a group of people getting together to try to buy a bunch of bulk food that they can't get in the regular traditional food system. And they grow and they become successful and they become large enough. They need to have a place where they can store the extra food because someone didn't get to come in on the pickup day. And they need a refrigerator, right? And they maybe need a freezer, right? And then in fact, they need to have cash available because someone might have forgotten it, right? Whatever, right? And so all of a sudden, so a store grows out of this thing, even just within the membership, right? And now all of a sudden it makes more sense about, right? In a food club, there are only members. In a food co-op, there is the world and their members. And it sort of, if you just wander in as an American customer to a co-op, you're like, well, why, what is this member thing? Why, I'm still just a customer. What's okay, you have some special deal. Well, it makes sense if you can understand a little bit of that language. I think it's related, right? Because if you grow to a certain size, then you don't need to track these individual things because you might have a way to store the extra or handle the financial tracking necessary to make that happen.
Right. Right. Who's next?
Oh, don't be shy, folks. If you're here and you've
Yes.
listened to me drone on about all that stuff, no question is too boring, too geeky, too weird, too niche.
Yay, thank you. Thank you. And then one more is needed before I can raise my hand. Please, please, somebody else raise their hand.
Hi. Greetings from Europe, first of all. It's pretty late here.
Thanks for
yeah, I really like your talk. And you teased earlier about the difference between the principles that Ostrom got to and the principles that co-ops evolved.
Yeah.
And yeah, I'd be interested to hear some of that.
Oh, okay. Well, so there are a couple of principles that the co-ops evolved that Ostrom did not have. And Ostrom was looking at factors that helped these organizations, these small, resource user groups of, forests and fisheries around the world survive. She was not looking at rules that made them more common. And I think there's a difference in the two rules that is a really important one. And you see it in a couple of different ways, but one major, I think the most important difference in my mind, the most interesting one to me as someone who studies the evolution of culture, is that the co-ops have a very clear rule that has taken different shapes over the years about communicating to other co-ops. Sometimes it's called we're going to take over the world. Sometimes it's called cooperation with other cooperatives. Sometimes it's called training, or we will train other cooperatives so that they can get going. So it's basically an explicit rule about between cooperative cultural transmission. And I think that's extremely important. And I think it has helped the whole type of organization flourish. And so that's the one that's most exciting to me. And there are others, and I could dive back in if you're interested.
Thank you.
That's great points. I look forward to returning to those myself. But first, Sudhindra.
Yeah.
Hi.
Hey there.
I really like that slide that you showed towards the end. And you talked about development.
Yes.
And how it is important to create an environment where cooperation is favored.
Yes.
I really appreciated that. So if you could talk about that a little bit. And
Sure. I want to get the slide right, though. Can I, would you mind if I try to do that?
Sure.
Yeah.
Because I want to, let's see here.
I think it was the second to the last.
Oh, I see. Way down here.
Yeah. Couple more back. One more back. There, number 3. Yeah, just creating an environment where the burden of cooperation doesn't fall on, individuals.
Yes.
And within that respect, so if you could develop on that a little bit, but also I was curious if someone has looked at the problem of free riders in a cross-cultural context in terms of like individualistic and collectivistic societies, whether intuitively it might seem that free riders are probably less likely if the environment has been a collectively minded.
Right. Yes. Those are excellent questions. Thank you. How should I say your name? Sudhindra? Sud. Okay, great. Yeah, that's easy. Thank you. Yeah, exactly. So there have been some. There's a growing amount of cross-cultural sort of psychological research that is connected. It's really more the cross-cultural anthropology stuff, where people will play these games in different societies. And one of the classic pieces, there are sort of two rounds of a bunch of exactly comparable economic games, including cooperative behavioral games like the ones that I used here, that were led by Joe Henrich, one that was published in his book in 2004, and another one that was published in 2010. And so I think, in short, the answer for some of what you're looking at, I'm going to try to summarize a bunch of things, is that yes, there are differences between societies. However, and I'm stepping a little bit outside of my experience because I don't spend a lot of time with the individualistic, collectivistic measures, but those are a very high level of generality. And my experience with cooperation is it's super fine. It is a super fine and fast behavioral variable. Humans are great at figuring out when it's a good time to cooperate, and who good cooperators are, and if they're with a group of good cooperators, and if they're not. And even if you're in a collective society, now there may be average differences too, right? But one of the things that, just to underscore your point, that Joe Henrich and folks found was that the nature of basically the nature of the core of the subsistence strategy in small scale societies and how collective it was tended to underscore or tended to sort of inform how people decided to deal with this sort of windfall that they were given through this experiment. And so the most extreme example was the Indonesian whale hunters called the Lamalera, who literally it takes a whole village to kill a whale. And so then you bring it back and everyone's sharing everything with everybody. There's no other way to do it. And so that's how you deal with windfalls in that region, if you're a Lamalera. And so you get a windfall in the experiment, and so you just give it away. You give over half of it away, no problem. And that's very different from other societies, like you say, which may well be more individualistic. I just think that particular individualistic, collectivistic measure, which is often based on a survey scale, is much less responsive and fine-tuned behaviorally than the cooperative games are. And they'll change, depending on the context, I think.
Yeah. Okay. Let's get back to the gallery view here. Then.
Oh yeah. Sorry.
So much to say. And actually, what you just said ties back to our previous seminar by Jerome Lewis on hunter-gatherer societies. And Jerome will be speaking again next week on the role of music in the social organization of hunter-gatherer societies. So that'll be great. But one of the points he made, which was so striking, these are completely sharing economies, and they don't have a word for thank you. They don't have a word for thank you because it's understood that what's yours is mine. I don't have to say, please give it to me and then thank you. No, if you have a surplus, we just take it. I mean, it's just like that's how embedded it is in the culture. But returning to our culture, I think that it's interesting to think about just a standard trade-off between financial capital and social capital, which I think explains quite a bit of the patterns. For example, that co-ops thrive when times are hard. In other words, when people don't have much money. And if we think, especially when
but you can invest socially.
And you invest socially, you've got social capital, you can develop social capital. But if you really do have money, then it is easier to just pay with a credit, march into a grocery store and pay with a credit card. So I guess one of my questions is, how much of these patterns can be explained by a fairly straightforward trade-off between financial capital and social capital?
Wow. Not being an economist, I don't think about the world that way very much at all.
You're not an economist?
I think that's a really good insight. And the way I think about it is, going back to when we were, cooperatively taking down large, dangerous animals for food, and how we don't have to do that anymore, right? Why? And the reason is, well, we've built all this. We've built agriculture. We've built industry. We've conquered nature. We live in plenty. Right? Humans are so unbelievably sort of spoiled as a species, right? And so we've got so much on the sort of financial or economic, or there's actually so many other just types of capital, but that we don't often have to rely on in say Western society in particular, we don't have to rely on social capital, which I think is explainable when you can think about the gigantic growth of all of these other types of capital. This is one reason why, just for me personally, I love it when the power goes out, or there's a tree down and the road is blocked, or something like this happens, right? There's a freeze and everything freezes and no one can drive and we have to clear the roads or something. I love that because we have to put aside all of our busy little activities that we all are, told to do by society. I rush off and do my things in my office, and I rush over here and I rush over there and I drive my kids around. I love it when all that has to stop and we have to actually talk to our neighbors and solve the physical problem that's about heat or water, food, because it's this base thing. And you realize, well, we've got this like capacity to do, like we could do this well. If the water actually stayed out, it wouldn't be easy, it'd be awkward and it might be uncomfortable, but we would solve it. And so I think it's there. And I think it's the fallback option, because the fact of the matter is it's easy not to have to rely on people who may not always be able to be generous or cooperative or altruistic, right?
Yeah. So we did experimental economics games in with Binghamton high school students and related it to socioeconomic status, and we found a hump-shaped curve where if you were poor, you didn't cooperate, and if you were rich, you didn't cooperate, and if you were in the middle, you did. And so these were the kids that were carpooling and doing car washes and bake sales and things like that. Because they didn't have the money, but they came from good neighborhoods, but so they had social capital, not financial capital. Last thing before I pass to Ian. Ian, I hope you still want to talk, but you showed that amazing building from the cooperative group of the UK, and we know the example of Mondragon, which at least up until the present has been able to survive and thrive in a market economy.
Yes.
Competition with more capitalistic organizations. So what accounts for that form of cooperatives
Okay. Yeah. And I didn't get a lot of time to talk about that detail. I hinted at it in the literature review. One of the things that keeps happening, I mean, you saw it a little bit with my preliminary data on the food buying clubs and the rules as they get older, right? And you don't see older clubs with very few rules. They have more rules, right? Is that trend continues. The older you get, the more chances you've had to grow as you grow the amount of purchasing, grow the amount of members, right? And it doesn't always have to happen that way. It doesn't always need to be the goal of the organization, but it happens. And as you grow, there's more to organize. And because there's more to organize, you need to organize it. And the way you organize it is with rules. And the challenge with that, of course, it's perfectly natural. That's what we do. That's organizational evolution. It's groups of humans culturally organized, right? Culturally organized cooperation. And so I can have a rule that says Tim needs to do this at this time. And depending on how I feel about that rule, I might feel like I'm doing it because it's perfectly natural and good and I feel satisfied, or I might feel like it's coercion, right? Or I could feel about it in lots of different ways. But the fact of the matter is that as cooperatives get larger, there are a number of good examples. One of them is REI, which is outdoor equipment cooperative. As they get larger, they get more structured and they become more sort of hierarchical in nature, in part because you have to. And so Mondragon is a good example of that, and the co-op group is too. Mondragon has a sort of like set of governance bodies. I looked into their operation. It's quite complex. There's a parliamentary system. It is still sort of cooperative in nature, but to compare it to these little food clubs, it's an entirely different beast. It's vastly more complicated and way more hierarchical out of necessity. So it's an interesting comparison. And I think, in my mind, this is really useful, right? We should think, okay, human organizations do this all the time, right? When there's nothing, when we have nothing, we form together and we solve the problem with our hands. We push on the rock together until we've moved it. And then you take the next step and you've got a food club. And then you take the next step and you've got a food cooperative. And then you take a handful more steps and you have, REI. And it doesn't need to be this thing where, in fact, I think the evidence sort of shows that we think about these things in categoricals, right? This is a cooperative and this is not. I think actually it's there's a lot of variation in between, and that as organizations become more basically larger, they need more structure fundamentally.
Yeah,
And so-
there's a great book on that topic. I bet you know it, Tim. It's called The Ritual Process by Victor Turner.
Yeah.
And he makes a distinction between his two key terms are communitas and structure. So communitas is the spirit of community, which we've been talking about.
Yeah.
Structure is the structure that's needed whenever society becomes, large to even to any degree. And then he thinks ritual is what ties, what anchors structure to communitas. And so that's a point there.
Yes.
Let me pass to Ian. I hope you still have some comment, Ian, and then I want to come back. Please, guys, raise your hands. Don't make me the only one. We don't want that.
Yes, actually, I appreciate the period to formulate my own thought and question here. It's not so much a question, actually. I'd love to hear your kind of more general, abstract, theoretical musings on the relationship between the kind of the degree of and nature of existential threat that humans face and our response in terms of those kind of two broad strategies. Do we go it alone or do we band together and go collective? Like,
okay, yeah. Okay, I see where you're going.
Yeah, like what are the limits of each of
right.
those and that type of stuff?
No, thanks. I love it. Well, I spend a lot of time thinking about the existential crisis that humans have put ourselves in by being so damn successful. I mean, that's my main job. That's my day job. And it's a really special challenge. And climate change, of course, is a great example. But I think there is a key here where, I'm just going to sort of try to give you some sound bites, and we'll see which ones stick. And you might want to turn one over and turn it back at me and ask a different question. But as you've seen, I think culturally organized human cooperation is what makes us special. It's what gives us our superpowers. It's why we took over. It's why we, have been able to destroy the world and other species and pollute the atmosphere. It's because we figured out these things and we do it as a group. Everything we do that's special or powerful is done as a group. So there's not going to be a world in which I'm not worried about individual selfishness so much as I am worried about the selfishness of larger level units, right? Nations and corporations. And so to address that question, if you don't mind, it seems to me that right now we have a problem just taking the climate change slice of the crisis, where corporations that emit more carbon dioxide per dollar that they make, and companies and countries which emit more carbon dioxide per unit of human well-being that they create. I'm sorry, I failed to do. Those two things are correlated in both cases, is what I mean to say. Right. It's easier to have higher well-being of your citizens if you as a country emit more carbon dioxide. It's easier to earn more and to be a larger market player if you as a company emit more carbon dioxide. That's the problem for climate change. And putting that in an evolutionary context, our challenge is to reverse the direction of selection of on corporations and on countries relative to their emissions of carbon dioxide in terms of their output. And that's a big ask, right? It means that we have to have companies that are the types of companies that are currently doing well, the types of nations that are currently doing well, need to be expiring faster than the ones that are doing the other thing. Now, of course, obviously, we get to change the rules by building new technology. So it's not all doom and gloom. It's not like we're saying we have to start just eliminating countries and companies. It's far more complex than that. But I don't know. There was a fun theoretical wander for you. Was that of use?
Comment on that, Ian?
Yeah, no, yes, I appreciate having it heard it that way.
Feel free to push back or open
no, I guess my question was, I probably didn't phrase it specifically enough, was more of the kind of the theoretical limits of individualism as a strategy versus coming together as a strategy, and in particular the way that the kind of existential threat that we as an evolved being face. Do we, is it when we're reasonably secure, do we just kind of drift apart and we have the luxury of going our own way, versus some intermediate tension where we have to come together and we going to put a little bit of our differences aside, versus a really massive existential threat, the type that formulates a tight culture. Now we're more as one, and then when would that break down? Like, when is too much threat too much and we become individuals again? That type of stuff. What are your thoughts around that?
Yeah. So I see the intermediate disturbance hypothesis in here. Totally.
And thank you for the indulgence as well. So,
oh, my pleasure. That's what I'm here for. This is great. And then I'd also want to get to Sage and Kathleen and X-Men. So I'll be quick.
And me.
And you're last in line, David.
No, I'm next in line. Wait a minute.
No, Sage and Kathleen and X-Men haven't gone yet. Sorry.
All right.
And so I just think briefly, in that I just want to add this other layer to your question. I don't have an answer, right? Because I think what you're saying is sort of like right on the money, right? It's a key worry, but it's just the other layer that needs to be added is, in my mind, you always have to track both the cooperation or competition within groups and the cooperation and competition between groups. And sometimes one is going to matter more than the other. And sometimes it's the groups that are the problem, or sometimes it's the individuals that are the problem. I think that's the thing that I want to, right? I don't believe there's a thing where it's like all people need to cooperate and it's going to be a smiley, happy world. It's more complex than that. I mean, on one level, with a very simple model that solves the problem, but the world is not that simple model. The world is multi-layered, and the way I think about it, at any given level of organization, you have an organization, you can think of it as an individual at the next scale up. And I know David thinks like this, so you've probably been influenced by him just like I have. So I'll call on X-Men next. He's next to my list.
Look, just a very quick question. You were talking about the co-ops and how they grew pretty large, and you gave some examples there. And I'm wondering if there's any work done to look at, as an organization, as a corporate organization grows in size, to what extent, the bureaucracy that it develops above out of necessity to some extent.
Yeah.
To what extent they apply, the pro-social principles, to give it a short description, or even the core design principles in that regard. Has there been any work done on that? And
not enough. Not at the level of abstraction that you and I are thinking of, to my satisfaction. That's the answer for me. People do look at it, but in organizational and management sciences, they're often using those lenses, which are sort of, we come from organizational psychology, and that's fine as far as it goes, but it's just not this general question where we're saying, is there a pattern that we can look at across the development of these types of organizations that all come into this situation where they need to grow? And so I think there's a lot to answer there. I'm gonna go next to Kathleen and then Sage and then David. X-Men, is that good?
Yeah. Yes, thank you. Thank you. I
Yeah.
just want to know where the status of the research was. Yeah, thank you.
No.
Well, thank you. I've really enjoyed your talk, and it's triggered a lot of thoughts that are not necessarily woven together in a very coherent way. But the comment you made about corporations being driven by, the profit margin that's produced by using more fossil fuels, for example, it's only true that they make more money when they are more productive using up fossil fuels, is because they're externalizing the actual cost of the fossil fuels. And there are methods that can regulate and level that kind of disequilibrium, like taxation. But that would require a collective energy amongst people to elect politicians that would vote for taxation. And so, there's many deep levels around individuals being more motivated to behave cooperatively that are related to the existential crisis of climate change. And I do sense that people are more motivated by the fact that it's not just enough to think about yourself. Most people think about their children and their grandchildren, and they are recognizing that there has to be a different level of cooperation because they can't turn away from the idea, well, it's like the doctors that are recognizing if they don't get involved with laws in the United States to regulate guns, or even the health industry, the costs of medical care, they're breaking their Hippocratic oath. So I just want to say that I think the Rochdale organization had a principle of deep democracy in the very beginning of their foundation.
Yes.
And I do think there is a link between recognizing the value of having individual identity with higher level values, and that's the spirituality.
I completely agree. No, Kathleen, thank you.
And it may not fit into your research, but I think it's important to recognize that it's not, that there are motivators kind of beyond self-interest.
No, right. Well, I mean, this whole thing is about my whole research on cooperatives is about trying to understand how that pro-sociality comes and goes. And I completely agree with everything you said. And it actually helps me think about maybe a little bit more of what Ian was saying. And so we can narrow our scope and say, I'm going to look at cooperation within this economic organization, within this company, right? But humans are multidimensional and society is multidimensional, right? And we have, thankfully, in democratic societies, we have a way to change group level structures, right? Through voting and through democracy. And so the nice thing is that the democratic system is itself a multi-level system in which we can find patterns of cooperation and similarity and conflict and competition as well. But I agree with you. And I also want to say that with regards to things like climate change, I think we're starting to see a change in the way that people are thinking about it, because stuff is breaking and it's scary. And when you look at the patterns of cooperation, when people experience extreme events, we come together. We tend to be really bad at anticipating or changing our behavior. Not that we don't anticipate. We tend to be really bad at changing our behavior in advance in order to avoid some avoidable types of things, such as climate, that fall into this category. But when it does happen, we're good at cooperating after the fact. And so, maybe we should do a little bit better. But I think the point is, anyway, the point is that I agree. That's my largest point. But I think that connects with what Ian was saying.
Thank you.
Sage, did you want to get in there?
Yes, I'll definitely go ahead of David. So mine's a little bit of a methods question, but I just wanted to reiterate a comment I made in the chat, which is
Yeah.
my excitement at seeing additional design principles to
Yes.
the core design principles. It's just something we've talked about. Of course, these rules must be contextual, so you expect them. But I'm just really interested in the mapping there.
Yes.
So how you take these Rochdale rules and map them to the CDPs, but also what's added. And there's an interesting point here, which I'll just add as well, about analogy. So the association of two concepts as they have something in common, and it's often implicit, and that this is like the most basic form of transmission of cultural ideas. And so there's a methods piece in there, and there's also more of like a ontological piece of just how people go about actually taking what Ostrom can call the design principles, and these are constructs, but they go by very different names in a given group. And so kind of how you pull that out is really interesting. Love to hear more.
I mean, there needs to be more work done on it, Sage. I mean, Taylor and I wrote the paper on the cooperative principles, and this was just like this. I mean, this thing actually was part of why we wanted to write the paper in the first place, because we were studying cooperatives and we learned about the cooperative principles and explored them more and more, and were just sort of struck by how similar they were, and thought, okay, well, surely there's some connection, right? And we didn't find it. But moreover, that wasn't what we were studying, and it just looks like this convergent evolution. And I agree with you about, it's biologically analogous, or culturally analogous. There's more work to be done on that connection, for sure. And I would like to be able to, I'll leave that.
Yeah, so let's talk more about transmission. You're right that the Ostrom 8 core design principles is about the governance of single groups. It is not about transmission. And so if we're going to talk about transmission, we have to talk about additional design principles. And even though you've done such a lovely study, kind of a historical study of the cooperative rules, which has a history, what I'm struck by typically is how poor the transmission is. And I'll bet you agree with this, that when a food club starts up, they're just making it up on their own. They're not looking around to find previous rules or anything like that. I was struck in Binghamton when there's a association of community gardens. And even at that scale, the community gardens don't learn from each other. There's no real mechanism for them to compare best practices and to I got some thumbs and thumbs up. And so that means there's tremendous rules for improvement. And we can think of it as basically what we need to socially construct is a cultural inheritance mechanism where we have targets of selection. We orient variation around the targets, and then we replicate best practices, better practices, realizing that they'll be sensitive to context. All of that has to be socially constructed. And when it's not, it's like you have just a really high mutation rate. So I think that we have a lot of nodding heads about that, but I think that's actually, to turn that with the pro-social commons, that's pretty much what we're doing. We have a bunch of groups, it's very co-created, and we can compare them with each other. We can say, gosh, our philosophy group's really doing well, better than our other groups. What are you doing? And so on and so forth. So building the inheritance mechanism and then ultimately making it global is what's needed. So
even at a small scale, Dave, just to quickly interject here, is one of the things that I have proposed, and particularly if I get this next grant, I'm going to come back and try to really help these food clubs and the website folks who serve all of these food clubs. There are hundreds of them, is by helping them to learn from each other, because I'm convinced that that's the single easiest way for all of them to do better. And there is not a good communication system. And it's, you don't need much more than that, I think. I mean, you're talking about something a little bit more intentional and effective. But just as an example, I completely agree.
Yeah, well, so I mean, that's why we teach the core design principles right up front. Also, there's a flexibility piece. I wanted in closing to mention a sociocracy, which many of us are familiar with. And what's interesting about that is that it's quite small scale, but it's very dense with rules. And so it's small,
Yep.
but it's got rules up the wazoo. And I think that's one reason why it's succeeded to the degree that it has. So even small groups actually require rules, and to bake that in, to make that salient and so on, I think is part of what we need to do. Sage, is your hand still up? And then we're a little over time. You could have the last word if you want.
Yeah.
Sorry, that was an oversight. So back to you,
Totally.
David.
Okay. Well, I mean, what this signals, friends, is that we're going to have so much more of this. I think that this is a sample of what's going on outside of pro-social world. There's many others that we can be drawing upon. And as we develop our research dimension, then I think we'll be collaborating with other researchers such as Tim, more and more and coordinating our own activities in order to basically use our own principles. So this is a taste, I think, of what we're going to have in abundance when we develop the research dimension of pro-social world along with the practice dimension. So study and steward are our two words: study, basic scientific research; steward, actually assisting in the cultural evolutionary process. And actually, Elizabeth, you've been quiet, but I think this is a way to plug your social accounting class. Could you please do that? And of course, that's all about institutions and rules and so on. So maybe we could end by just talking about the class that you're going to be teaching for free to members of the Pro-Social Commons, an award-winning class over there at ASU.
Thank you. Yeah, we'll be starting it March 1st. It'll run for 8 weeks and be looking about the tangible and intangible assets that organizations and communities use. And the tension that you talked about between financial and social capital, we'll talk about that, trade-offs. But the important thing is that the intangibles can be developed endogenously, right? So that's one reason. And then how to account for the resources and tell your impact story better.
Nice.
Yeah. So we'll be stay tuned for announcement of that. And then we have basically the rest of February to recruit. And I think that's going to be a wonderful step forward. Elizabeth specializes on nonprofit organizations. And I think the distance between a nonprofit organization and a cooperative is
not that large.
And so I think that there's a whole world of nonprofit organization literature that goes along with the for-profit management literature, and many of the same dysfunctions. So it's all a great topic. All right, everybody. So all good. We'll see you next week for Jerome Lewis on the role of music in the organization of hunter-gatherer societies. That's next week.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Tim.
My pleasure.
Much. Bye-bye.